Is another big news day in Ottawa. Justin Trudeau announced this morning he is resigning as leader of the Liberal Party. He will stay on until a new leader is chosen. Now, this comes after weeks of pressure from inside the Liberal Party and among his own MPs. We'll get analysis, and our phone lines are open to you. Your reaction to Justin Trudeau resigning, and now that the race is on for a new Liberal leader, what does this mean for the next election? I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. And if you are watching us on television and on our live stream, you may notice we look a little different. We are joining you from Studio 10, our radio studio, as we deal with some technical issues on the TV studio side. But we want to make sure we get all of your calls on, because I imagine we will get many calls throughout the hour as we spend the hour on, again, momentous news coming out of Ottawa. After weeks of pressure and speculation that he would resign, this morning, Justin Trudeau spoke outside Rideau Cottage.
I've also had a chance to reflect and have had long talks with my family about our future. Throughout the course of my career, any success I have personally achieved has been because of their support and with their encouragement. So last night over dinner, I told my kids about the decision that I'm sharing with you today. I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process. Last night, I asked the President of the Liberal Party to begin that process. This country deserves a real choice in the next election, and it has become clear to me that if I'm having to fight internal battles, I cannot be the best option in that election.
We are taking your calls. What is your reaction to Justin Trudeau stepping down as Liberal leader? And what do you think this means for the next election? Love to hear from you. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can also hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can send an email to bctoday@cbc.ca. Joining me now is Richard Johnston, Professor Emeritus in Political Science at the University of BC. Richard, welcome back to BC Today.
Hi, Michelle.
Good to speak with you today. It sounds like Justin Trudeau has taken his own walk in the snow, just as the elder Trudeau did in 1984. Well, what's your reaction?
Well, his father required less prodding than he did. Mind you, he'd also been around for a lot longer. He's brought this on himself. He's been tone deaf about the predicament he's landed this party in. He's been willfully deaf also, I think, to the internal dissent in the party. And by putting it off to the new year, it's not a constitutional crisis, but he's in a sense forced upon us not really appropriate use of the prorogation power.
What do you make of that? So he asked the Governor General to prorogue Parliament, to be able to prorogue Parliament until March 24th. She has allowed it. So what does that mean for the timeline now then? Can you just go through that with us?
Well, first of all, it's not just simply the adjournment of a session. It is the ending of a session. And so that means that the order paper basically dies. The committees, except for internal economy, I believe, are all now dissolved. So there's no chair, there's no rules, there's no basis for meeting. And so any of the sort of embarrassing stuff that might be underway, if it were merely a recess, is now stopped. Also, it's a long prorogation. I mean, in the 19th century, it wouldn't have been a long prorogation, but that's in an era in which Parliament met for maybe 4 months. But it's a long prorogation by current standards because nothing legislative or budgetary can happen. 2 months is a long time. It's dictated by the internal leadership procedure necessities of the Liberal Party. And I understand that, and in some sense, it might actually make the next election a more meaningful one than it would otherwise have been. But, there's a lot of parliamentary business, and a lot of the stuff is potentially embarrassing for the government. And, the power is being abused to the extent that that's what it does.
And we had the same debate, didn't we, when Stephen Harper moved to prorogue Parliament? And there was a lot of criticism from the Liberals at that time.
Oh yes, They're it's a pretty hypocritical world that way. In Mr. Harper's defense, it has to be said he had just won an election. It wasn't a decisive victory, but it wasn't really any less decisive than the one in 2021. Whereas now we are over 3 years into this parliament, so there's no sense in which a fresh mandate from the people can be justified to give some sort of procedural wiggle room to the Prime Minister.
Let me just try.
An old, tired government.
Let me just try to get some more clarity on what this means then for the next election. So this essentially gives them more than 2 months to find a new leader. Is that right?
Yes. Well, 2 months, basically, a little bit less than 2 months.
Okay.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry, more than 2 months. In the short run, it means that the news headlines will shift from Parliament to the leadership selection process. In the past, to the extent that the party undergoing the leadership process, especially if it's the governing party, hogs the headlines, that can actually help the government at least temporarily, right? All of the talk effectively over the next little bit will be about who will lead the party and what kind of party will that person lead. So that means the Liberals, in a sense, control the news agenda. Whether that would be enough to affect the results of the next election is pretty doubtful. There are certainly cases going back to 1984 and before in which resignation or retirement late in the term of Parliament by the Prime Minister creates an opening for the party to renew itself. In general, the history of that isn't very good for the Liberal Party, nor is it particularly good for the Conservative Party. Mostly this is a story about the Conservative, or rather about the Liberal Party.
Right.
That the only time that the government actually gets any kind of real advantage out of a late term shift in the leadership is when a new face from Quebec takes over a party that's been led by an Anglophone from outside Quebec for a while. Pierre Trudeau, for example, in 1968. Louis Saint-Laurent in 1948-9. I don't think that's the scenario we're looking at this time.
Okay. So some thoughts there around what this means for the next election. What are the implications of a new leader for the Liberal Party as another federal election takes place, expected later this year? Asking you, what is your reaction to Justin Trudeau announcing he is resigning as leader of the Liberals? He will stay on until a new leader, his successor, is chosen. What do you think about that? What do you think this means for the next election? 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your phone as well, or email us bctoday@cbc.ca. My guest is Professor Emeritus in Political Science at UBC, Richard Johnston. Let's take a call from Carrie in Surrey now. Hi there, Carrie. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. And in response to your question, I do think it's a very sad day for Canada. If for those of us who've been following the foreign interference inquiry and scandal, as well as the FBI indictment that proved that Russia was paying Canadian influencers to influence our Canadian discourse, there's no question that played a huge role in where we are now. And I think it's very telling that how much it took to take them down. It took the Indian government, Chinese government, Russian government, oil and gas industry. Stephen Harper is chairman of the Independent Democratic Union. And And the corporate media, not CBC, not reporting on Trudeau's accomplishments, ignoring Pierre Poilievre, not fact-checking him. So I hope now, if nothing else, the media will focus on the outcome of the Foreign Interference Inquiry report. I hope they now start reporting on Pierre Poilievre. Like, for example, he just did an absolutely embarrassing, horrific interview with Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
So I really hope this does shift the discussion.
And Carrie, you referred to the possibly various factors that had been acting against Trudeau, but what about just the general sense of the public's, whether it's fatigue or feeling of a disconnect that the Prime Minister has had with, struggling middle-class Canadians?
Yeah, so with that, because I'm someone who's lucky enough to travel, the stories of what people are experiencing in Canada is the same the world over. So how do you explain to Canadians it's not as bad here as it is to everyone else? It's just, since COVID, things have just changed for everyone. So I think that in itself is an uphill battle. What bothers me is I don't think we've had fulsome, honest conversations, and that's what I wish we will start having now.
Carrie, good to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's Carrie joining us from Surrey. Bill is our next caller now. Hi, Bill.
Hello.
Hi.
I think this is the exact reason why we should adopt a two-term maximum for change. It's way too long. It doesn't matter what party is in power. It should be 2 terms, and that's it. I used to be an NDP supporter until the NDP started propping up the Liberals. And the main reason why is because the most legal, law-abiding people in Canada are the firearms owners. And Trudeau thought that to curb gun crime, you go after the low-hanging fruit. And the firearms owners in Canada, most legal, law-abiding people in Canada. You have to be. We're checked daily. So to come after us and the hunters, that was outrageous. And he lost my vote and many other law-abiding Canadians
on that issue.
Okay. Alone, yes.
Bill, thank you so much for your call. Tim is next in Kamloops. Hi, Tim. What's your reaction to Trudeau's resignation, announcing he's resigning?
Well, it's not surprising. He just did a Stephen Harper. So the Conservatives can't, I think, go at the Liberals because he did exactly what Stephen Harper did when he ran to Michael Jean to make sure he wasn't voted out by a non-confidence motion by Dion, Duceppe, and Layton. The one thing I found in Pierre Poilievre's reaction, which is really interesting, he said that all the other Liberals who are possibly going to run are trying to protect their pensions, which I find really interesting because doesn't Pierre Poilievre have at least over 20 years of pensions? So is he going to give his up in order to give an example of that, I would think? The other thing is, is like if Pierre Poilievre, what if events, dear boy, events, as the British Prime Minister is famously quoted? Because what is not to say that if there's an election, regardless of who the new Liberal leader is, what if Pierre Poilievre gets in but he gets a minority? Who's he going to deal with if that's the case? And again, how do we know how Trump might just use him as his little bully boy? So let's face facts. We'll have to see how it all goes, but it's not surprising. And Pierre Poilievre, let's compliment the guy. He's one of the best hypocritical corporate gatekeepers this country has ever produced.
We'll have to see. Tim, thank you very much. You said it there. We'll have to see how this all goes. Now, you mentioned Pierre Poilievre. He did issue a statement shortly after Justin Trudeau spoke this morning, and let's hear part of that now.
So given that Liberal MPs and leadership contenders unanimously supported everything Trudeau has done, why dump him now, right before an election? Have they had a change of heart? Is it because they feel guilty that they doubled housing costs, hiked taxes, unleashed crime, broke immigration, forced a quarter of the population into poverty? No. They continued supporting Trudeau when he did all of those things. No, their only objection is that he is no longer popular enough to win an election and keep them in power.
That's Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre in a recorded statement issued this morning. And we're taking your calls, asking for your reaction on the open line. I'm also joined by my guest, Richard Johnston, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at UBC. And, you know, it's interesting, Richard, Justin Trudeau spoke this morning of internal battles, right? That he couldn't, given internal battles, he didn't see himself as a choice to bring forward the Liberals through an election. He didn't speak very much about what the pressure was like from outside the party. And I'm wondering what you think this all means for how the Conservatives will run an election campaign.
Well, I think you've already heard the basics of how the Conservatives will deal with that question. Poilievre is emphasizing that they all supported them through everything until the very end. And it was indeed their reading of the polls, combined with the fact that the resignation letter by Chrystia Freeland, in some sense, created an opening, a poll of public opposition from a highly placed person within the party, who in effect was declaring an intent to run for the leadership. Until she did that, it was all kind of formless. But I think that it's going to be hard for them to disclaim their share of responsibility for the policies of the government.
And that's right. That's the point that Poilievre has been making. What do you think of the choices that the names that have been thrown around? Then we've heard about Chrystia Freeland, possibly, and the current now Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc, former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, who I guess you could say has some distance from previous policies. And what do you think of some of the names thrown around? Christy Clark here in BC.
I don't think it's a particularly impressive menu. I mean, in some ways, Dominic LeBlanc is the route of least resistance. He's fully bilingual, for one thing, and I don't think we should discount that importance, but not from Quebec, but still. But he would be, he's the kind of consummate stopgap. He would be the person who represents the most continuity with Trudeau. Chrystia Freeland, I think, has, on one hand, helped her case by distancing herself from Trudeau, and also from by putting it in terms that are a softer version of the arguments that are often made in favor of Carney, that are maybe a shift back towards business liberalism, at least some distance. On the other hand, I should think that there's a fair amount of resistance inside the party in supporting his leader, someone who really put the bullet in his head in the first place. I mean, I think opinion is going to be rather divided on that matter. Also, I don't know, she's not that impressive a platform performer. Christy Clark, I find this puzzling and implausible. I mean, she does have a history as a federal Liberal, to be sure, and I guess she would be positioning herself as yet another potential business Liberal, but I just don't see her as plausibly a candidate for the leadership of the federal party.
And there's been very little...
But also, since she's been out of power for so long in BC herself.
And really very few, if not any, examples of BC British Columbians.
And they're not happy ones for the leadership. And
I want to...
One thing about Mark Carney, we don't know. We have no idea what kind of chops this person has as a parliamentary and electoral person. There's a bit of a history of fronting outsiders, not always distinguished ones like Carney, but as fronting outsiders as possible solutions to the problem. But honestly, generally speaking, it doesn't happen, and there's no particular evidence that it would work.
There's also reporting now that Jonathan Wilkinson, another BC MP, is organizing a leadership bid himself, according to a source. I want to ask you a bit about Chrystia Freeland, and I'm asking this because when she announced her resignation, there was some chatter already about her eventually throwing her hat in, or this was kind of her statement saying, I'm going to run for the leadership. We got a lot of calls here from people saying they'd like to see that. And when you say she's not that impressive, did she not negotiate a new NAFTA for Canada?
She's an impressive human being. It's the platform. I just, I don't, I mean, she hasn't had much opportunity to sort of be a deeply rhetorical person that you might want the party leader and prime minister to be.
Okay.
But there is a kind of technocratic quality to her which in some ways is her strength. But I think in the current context, someone who has a more popular touch might be a more plausible leader. And honestly, I can't come up with the name.
Let's
she is a plausible candidate for the job.
Let's take another call here from Chris in Richmond now. What are your thoughts on Justin Trudeau resigning as Liberal leader, Chris?
Hi, hello.
Hi, thanks for calling. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a long time coming, but I'm a bit more concerned about what's happening next. Like, what's going on after this? So you've mentioned the possibility of Christy Clark being kind of in the fray again. What I'm afraid to say is that, unfortunately, there is a decently high chance that that's going to happen, because there are a number of natural advantages for the federal Liberals to choose her. It's that she's fairly distant from the current administration. She's got Western Canadian support, and she's fairly closer to the right wing, which maybe might erode support from the Conservative majority. So unfortunately, there's a lot of natural advantages that she has. What I want to know is what effects that might have on people here in Vancouver. That's the main concern I have.
A great question. And we're going to look into the British Columbia view with our provincial affairs reporter coming up in the next half hour as well. Richard Johnston, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Great to speak with you. That's Richard Johnston, Professor Emeritus at UBC's Department of Political Science. It's 12:28 now. This is BC Today here on CBC. And as we said, opposition leaders are chiming in on what this resignation means for when Canadians hit the ballot box. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh spoke earlier today, lambasting his political opponents.
And frankly, it's not just Justin Trudeau. It's every Liberal minister, every Liberal MP who looked down their nose at you when people were saying we can't make ends meet. We are struggling with the cost of living. So it doesn't matter who the next Liberal leader is. They've let you down. They do not deserve another chance. Under Pierre Poilievre, the Conservatives, they want to see CEOs get richer and richer and the middle class fall further behind.
That is Jagmeet Singh, leader of the NDP. Much more of your calls coming up in our next half hour as well. Lots of emails coming in on this. Allison writes from Nelson, I, for one, am glad that Trudeau stepped down. There was no way that he would win another election based on the relentless attacks from Pierre Poilievre. The Conservative leader is so blatant in his attacks and rhetoric and desire for power. Poilievre has no vision for Canada. I hope this time for a leadership campaign and then election will make it more evident to all Canadians. And Patricia writes us, I have questions about this proroguing compared with the Harper government's action to do the same. The Governor-General must take this decision very seriously within our parliamentary system. Patricia, thank you so much for your email as well. We will go through many more of your emails. Again, it's bctoday@cbc.ca. Coming up in our next half hour after the CBC News Update.
Good afternoon. Premier David Eby is thanking Justin Trudeau for his service after the Prime Minister announced his plans to resign at a news conference this morning. Eby says that even though he didn't always agree with Trudeau, they were partners in important issues such as lowering childcare costs. Former Premier Christy Clark also thanked Trudeau on social media, adding that as a lifelong Liberal, she looks forward to the upcoming leadership race. Clark says it is the biggest opportunity in more than a decade to grow the party and welcome new members. People in the Kootenays who rely on ferry service across Kootenay Lake are celebrating a temporary reprieve in a labor dispute after it threatened that threaten to drastically reduce service. The BC Labour Relations Board has granted a stay on its earlier decision to permit sailings to be cut by up to 90%. The ruling allows ferry service to continue as normal while the board reconsiders the union's essential service order. And the Canadian Food Inspection Agency says avian flu has been detected at another commercial poultry operation in Abbotsford. BC now has 64 infected sites with more than 8.5 million birds affected. And now the forecast. Wind warnings are in effect for Haida Gwaii and sections of the north coast. Highs around -7 with a mix of sun and cloud this afternoon in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, mainly cloudy with a high of -5. Highs around 0 with some sun and cloud in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 3. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, lots of sunshine this afternoon with highs around 8 degrees. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Nice to be with you in the studio.
Yes.
As
what
opposed
a
to through a
change.
camera.
Yeah,
Yes, a bit
very
of a
nice.
change. Had some technical difficulties,
We have
issues.
those occasionally, yes.
They happen. What a way to start the year. Big news and technical
bit.
issues. So some problems over on the TV set. We want to make sure that we get on air and get all our callers on air as well. So we decided to do it in here and visit with you, Rob.
Very nice. I don't mind you taking over my chair. You're welcome, Michelle.
It was warm. So thanks for that. Rob Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Lots of emails coming in on Justin Trudeau resigning. Vivian writes, she supports Trudeau. Vivian thinks Trudeau was right to resign. I was opposed to many of his policies, but the thought of Mr. Poilievre as Prime Minister is frightening. I hear the same kind of hatred coming from him as from Mr. Trump. We should be careful who we vote for. Stephen writes, the Liberals have two tasks to succeed during the next election. First, to form the official opposition rather than have the NDP fill that role. Second, to put the Conservatives in a minority government position rather than a majority. Chrystia Freeland would not be the right choice. She has been brilliant in her government roles, but lacks warmth and charisma. If her great intellect and drive were combined with the warmth and charisma of Bonnie Henry, head of the public health in BC during COVID, then it would work, but isn't the case. Mark Carney would be the most successful in the coming election, but would he want to serve as leader of the opposition for years and years? Just some thoughts from Stephen in Nelson. Frank writes, well, I hope nothing horrible happens during prorogation. I suspect a lot of Canadians will get out of Dodge, so to speak. Good time for Trump to make Canada the 51st state. Okay, Frank, a little tongue-in-cheek there. Thank you so much for your emails. It's 12:34 now. You're with BC Today here on CBC. I'm Michelle Elliott, and we are taking your calls on Justin Trudeau announcing this morning that he would step down and resign as Liberal leader, and he'll stay on until a successor is chosen. And Parliament is prorogued until March 24th. That does give the Liberal Party more than 2 months to choose a new leader before the possibility of another federal election. Now, this all comes after weeks of pressure from within his own party to step down. And MPs say they were worried about the Liberal Party's chances in an election with him as leader. Now, we are taking your calls. What is your reaction? What does this mean for an election? 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And BC political leaders have been responding today as well. Premier David Eby sent out a statement that says, in part, while we didn't always agree, I want to thank Justin Trudeau for serving as Prime Minister during some very difficult times our country has faced. Today, we face new challenges and serious threats. Regardless of who is the next Prime Minister, we must come together as Canadians to protect workers and businesses against devastating tariffs. Those that reference to incoming President-elect Donald Trump and his tariff threat of 25% on Canadian goods. BC Conservative leader John Rustad wrote, the resignation and prorogation of Parliament mark a pivotal moment for British Columbia and all Canadians. It's clear that Canadians are rejecting divisive, ideological leadership and are demanding a return to common sense government. Okay, taking more of your calls. Our numbers again are 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And joining me with more reaction from on the ground in British Columbia is CBC's provincial affairs reporter, Katie DeRosa. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this big day. Can you tell us more about those statements from David Eby and John Rustad? What does Trudeau's resignation mean for BC?
Well, interestingly, unlike other premiers, David Eby did not take questions from reporters today. He issued a statement. And as you noted, he highlighted some of the common ground that he and Trudeau had, such as affordable childcare, but he also said they disagreed on issues. And I would say that's an understatement. Premier David Eby has spent the last 2 years of his leadership slamming Trudeau for forgetting about BC, leaving it behind on issues like immigration and economic development. And he accused Trudeau of favoring vote-rich Ontario and Quebec and showering them with cash is a phrase he used. So, I think the statement kind of glosses over that. John Rustad also said that Eby and Trudeau are aligned on many issues, and Rustad said that Eby has lost his closest ally in Ottawa. And Rustad accused Eby of no longer having someone to point the finger at to blame for BC's issues, accusing Eby of blaming Ottawa for its problems on decriminalization, public safety, and other big issues like also the carbon tax. So a bit of a infighting between Rustad and Eby over Trudeau's resignation and what it means for BC.
It's like who can distance themselves the most, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Now let's go through some BC names. CBC has learned from a source that Jonathan Wilkinson, the Natural Resources Minister and a North Vancouver MP, is organizing a leadership bid. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so sources are also saying that Christy Clark is also considering a leadership bid. Jonathan Wilkinson's name has come up as well. Christy Clark has not confirmed that, and neither has Jonathan Wilkinson, but both of them are said to have teams organizing in the background and are really just trying to sort out their timing. Of course, Christy Clark has the benefit of leading a major political party in BC, being the premier, and a bit of an outsider status, which gives her some distance from the Liberal government, which is unpopular right now. So, she has that in her pocket, and certainly some British Columbians we spoke to today said they like Christy Clark and they would like to see her as leader. Jonathan Wilkinson is, of course, the energy minister. He has previously been the CEO of a renewable energy company, but I would argue he doesn't have as much name recognition in BC as Christy Clark. So definitely some BC names coming up, but we'll have to see if they have success.
We talked about that level of success, but pretty much nil, I think, from BC with our previous guest. But what has been the sort of rate of success here for British Columbians wanting to rise to the federal leadership levels?
Right. The federal Liberals have never had a leader from BC, and there's only been one prime minister from BC, and that was Kim Campbell. That was very short-lived. So not a lot of success because, again, of the amount of votes in Ontario and Quebec. We are told that Christy Clark is learning French to beef up her dual language chops, and her statement on Twitter was bilingual. So clearly she's trying to put to test her French abilities. But again, certainly BC politicians haven't had great success. But again, I think there's many issues that BC wants to get on the table, such as the border issues. So at least to have BC represented on that stage, I think would be good.
Interesting too. Yes, Christy Clark's statement on Twitter, both in English and French, and part of it says that as a lifelong Liberal, I look forward to joining tens of thousands of Canadians to choose our next leader. This is the biggest opportunity in over a decade that we've had to grow our party and welcome new Liberals, including Canadians concerned about the future of our country. Let's seize it. And I saw some replies to that tweet saying, "What, Christy Clark, seizing the opportunity to go for a Liberal leadership." So some of the conversation on Twitter, on X this morning. Katie DeRosa is with me, CBC's provincial affairs reporter here in BC, taking your calls here on BC Today. Your reaction to Justin Trudeau resigning as Liberal leader. Parliament will be prorogued until March 24th. Rob is our next caller now in Vernon. Hi, Rob. Go ahead. Thanks for calling.
Yeah, hi. So want to lay my cards on the table. I'm a member of the Liberal Party of Canada. I'm a strong Liberal, and I have been campaign manager in 2 elections previously. I live in a very conservative area, and I think it was inevitable that Mr. Trudeau was going to have to resign just because the accumulation of negative rhetoric that has been thrust out there by the Conservative Party. I kind of wish Mr. Trudeau had resigned about a year ago so that a leadership, a proper leadership conference could have been held, convention held, and a leader put in place to carve out their own particular policy. I'm very, very concerned about Pierre Poilievre. Mr. Poilievre engages in vindictive and classless rhetoric, much of which is dis and misinformation. And
can I just get you to be specific when you say that? What are you referring to?
Well, today, for example, he said in a I think it's a video of some sort that the Conservatives typically use, is that the Liberal Party hated Mr. Trudeau. That's totally incorrect. The Liberal Party doesn't hate Mr. Trudeau, but that's Mr. Poilievre's language. And it's very typical of what we're seeing in the United States that Donald Trump uses. And I don't think that Mr. Poilievre, to use one of your guests' phrases, has the chops to be the Prime Minister of Canada. I think that Mr. Trudeau was misunderstood in many ways. His education was the subject of a lot of misinformation. His commitment to Canada was the subject of a lot of misinformation. And, it just seems like whoever gets the last word, divisive word, in Mr. Poilievre's case, kind of gets the attention.
So, Rob, it's so interesting to hear from you. As a former campaign manager, then, what do you want to see from a new leader from the Liberal Party heading into the next election? How would you advise them in a campaign?
Well, I would advise them to come out with a solid policy program. There's a lot of the policies of the federal Liberals that a lot of people don't like. But, you take the carbon tax policy, for example. You won't find an economist in Canada that won't tell you that the carbon tax isn't the fairest way to tax polluters. And yet the public, broadly speaking, is totally opposed to the carbon tax. And they don't seem to understand the facts and the reasoning behind the carbon tax. So Mr. Trudeau, of course, was vilified, and Mr. Poilievre clearly doesn't understand the logic behind the carbon tax. And he spouts a lot of rhetoric that just doesn't make any sense. So, I think a leader like Mr. Carney and your previous guest, the political science prof. I also have a degree in political science, but I think that when he says he's not sure Mr. Carney has the chops, what that tells me is he doesn't know Mr. Carney. Mr. Carney is an amazing individual and would be by
I think he said in Parliament as a parliamentarian.
Oh, yeah. You haven't seen him in Parliament. How can he make a judgment when he hasn't seen him in Parliament? So what I'm saying is that sure, the Liberals have been in for 10 years, and it's not uncommon, after a 10-year session that people get tired of the people that are there, and that's been the history of politics in Canada. But in the past, like I'm old enough to remember that if the Liberals lost and the Mulroney Conservatives walked in, I would be okay because I knew that Brian Mulroney would always do the right thing. But under the current leadership of the Conservative Party, I don't believe that's the case anymore. So, yeah. We'll have to see what happens, and Canadians will decide.
They absolutely will. And Rob, you just echoed what another caller said earlier. We'll see what happens next. Thank you so much for your call. Good to hear from you and your perspective. Thank you so much. Gordon is next in Vancouver. Hi, Gordon. Hi, Gordon. Are you there? Okay, let's try Ben. Hi, Ben. Are you there?
I don't know whether you're speaking into my line or not.
Okay, and my apologies. Who's speaking right now?
Oh, I'm DLJ.
DLJ. Hi, DLJ. Thanks so much for calling in. And what do you want to say about Justin Trudeau?
Oh, thank you very much for taking my call. I am just so relieved. I am so relieved. I haven't been this relieved since 2015. I'm an NDP supporter, and back in 2015, we had a candidate for the PM's job, Thomas Mulcair. He was so articulate, and when he was asked the question, he would not only answer it, but it would be like an educational experience to listen to his just so inarticulate that it's embarrassing. So as far as a successor is concerned, I ask myself, where is Jane Philpott when you need her? She would be somebody amazing. I know she has a bright new job, but yeah, she was also somebody easy to listen to.
Okay. So the kind of rhetorical skills that you're looking for.
Yeah, I felt embarrassed as a Canadian. It just didn't seem to be. I mean, he a lot of people found him handsome, but that didn't do it for me. I want somebody who can represent us more adeptly, and yeah, okay. I'm relieved.
DLJ, thank you so much for your call. That's DLJ in Vancouver. And let's, as we wait for the next caller on the line, I'll put out the phone numbers again in our last 12 minutes of the program here. 1-800-825-5950 if you want to share your reaction to Justin Trudeau announcing he is resigning as leader of the Liberal Party after much pressure from within the party from a number of MPs and, of course, polling numbers showing a very low likelihood of winning the next election. What do you think? What are your thoughts on his resignation announced today? Parliament will be prorogued until March 24th, and that gives the Liberals some time, about 2 months, to find a new leader heading into the next election. We've heard from opposition parties already saying no matter who the leader is going to be, of the Liberals, they were ministers. They were people who supported the policies of Justin Trudeau. So love to hear from you. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. I think we do have Gordon in Vancouver now. Hi, Gordon.
Yes, hello.
Hello there, and great to have you. What are your thoughts? What's your reaction?
Well, I'd like to commend you on and your guest speaker, the professor from UBC, on being critical of the Liberal government, and yourself. You very deftly handled the your callers and taking them to task on statements that they make. Obviously, it's been very emotional. The callers coming in, there's a lot of emotion driven in this current times. I was a conservative, and I was convinced by my children in 2015 to vote Liberal, which I did. Because the Harper government was long in the tooth, they became complacent, and Harper was probably not the best person to be in the party. He should have stepped aside and let somebody new and young reinvigorate the party. But if we look back at those times, that in BC we had the fast ferries, problem fiasco, and the government spending issues. I think there was something about a $5,000 or $7,000 hammer being purchased.
Right, the provincial politics.
Yes, yes. But federally, we were looking at the Conservatives and saying, they're just not doing what needs. It's time for a change, and I think that's indicative of today. There is time for a change, and what we've been doing hasn't worked, so we need to change it up. I find that a lot of people that you speak with and callers that come in are very, negative towards the Conservatives when we've always only been a two-party, country in Canada. So it's time to give them a chance and try and right this train that that we're on.
And Gordon, what do you make of, a lot of the criticism of the Conservatives would be criticism of Pierre Poilievre for, relying on slogans essentially, and saying things that are would be perceived as divisive, for example. So, what are your thoughts on him personally as a leader?
I've had a chance to meet with him and speak with him, and I would like us to remember that this divisive and negative type of campaigning first came about in 2015 when the Liberals were, the Stop Harper, stop signs, the sloganing was actually it's a Liberal technique that was first brought on. So he is only playing the game that has been dealt to him. And the problem is he plays it better. I mean, he's articulate, he's educated, he's fast on his feet, he has a lot of qualities where he sticks to what he says. He's not duplicitous and he's not talking out of both sides of his mouth,
Really good to hear from you, Gordon. Thanks so much for the call.
Thank you for taking our calls.
Take care. That's Gordon in Vancouver. Let's take one more call before I go back to Katie DeRosa. And William is actually calling us from south of the border at Port Townsend. Hi, William.
Hi, good afternoon.
Yes, I'm curious to hear what you have to say watching from south of the border.
Well, I lived in Canada for years, and I follow Canadian news closely. My son is a Canadian, lives in Vancouver, and I agree with him. He says the reason that did Trudeau in was the post-COVID inflation anti-incumbency wave that impacted pretty much all the world, impacted Canada too. At least a year ago, it was clear he should step aside and let someone else carry the baton. I would like to see Chrystia Freeland get in office because he would be no friend of Donald Trump's, and I like that a lot.
William, thank you. I understand you're a former newspaper columnist as well.
I was a newspaper columnist in Montreal for the Gazette.
Oh, wow. Well, great to hear from you. Thanks so much for the call. Interesting point you raise about the challenges that incumbent governments have had around the world that we've seen as well. So that's interesting to throw into the discussion there. That's William joining us from Port Townsend in the United States. Well, let's just hear from one of the MPs who had been calling publicly for Justin Trudeau to resign. Ken Hardy is a Port Kells MP in Surrey.
Well, it had the sense of inevitability about it because, it's been like background radiation. It's been growing and growing and growing for actually a number of years. And, if you were to look inside the heart and soul of individual Liberal MPs, there'd be a bit of sadness, a lot of regret. But again, this is inevitable. One way or the other, this was going to happen. And it looks like maybe today's the day.
Why regret?
Well, a number of different things. I think that, and I can only speak for myself personally because I don't canvass the other members on their specific feelings. But I know personally over the number of years, I've seen opportunities missed, disconnects happening. You get inside that big echo chamber in Ottawa, in the Prime Minister's office and all of the people around them. They can get awfully detached from the sentiments of everyday Canadians at street level. The government has done a lot of things. And in fact, government is still working. I have to mention that right off the top, regardless of what's happening with leader. Ministers are out doing their job. We're looking at the Trump administration and what we need to do about that. And Ministers LeBlanc and Jolly are quite engaged there. But I could see things that weren't happening as well as they should have, or things that we missed doing. And I think that those are probably the nature of the disconnect that I was talking about. Things that people on the street were looking for government to do that maybe we weren't doing, although we were doing a lot of other things that were really good.
That's Ken Hardy, BC MP for the Liberals, having been calling for Justin Trudeau to resign. I should add that he was speaking this morning on the early edition as news came out that Trudeau would be making an announcement. So this was prior to the announcement outside Rideau Cottage. Let me wrap up with Katie DeRosa, BC Provincial Affairs reporter for CBC. We've heard what kind of an assessment there from Ken Hardy on how the government did, where the misses were, what he felt was a success. We've heard from, callers saying that this was, what their thoughts are in terms of what Trudeau did or didn't do. What do you see as the mood among the BC electorate? Here we are, having just come through our own election, a provincial election a few months ago. What's your sense of the mood among the electorate here in BC, Katie?
Well, I think what the BC election told us is we're kind of seeing a hollowing out of the centre to some extent. People are solidly in either a more to the left progressive or perhaps more of a conservative camp. And we saw that through the collapse of BC United, the former BC Liberal Party, which again has no affiliation to the federal Liberals, but that was the party Christy Clark once led. So I think that's going to be difficult for potential BC politicians to sort of try and straddle this middle ground and try and deliver a strong message when we are seeing increased polarization in our politics. So I think that could be an uphill battle, but certainly the economy seems to be the big issue that everyone is looking for answers on. Inflation, cost of living. So I expect those to be the big issues. And whether or not Christy Clark or Jonathan Wilkinson confirm today will have to be determined. But certainly the leadership race is going to be very interesting.
It will be. We've heard from a few callers now saying we will see what happens. It will be up to, I guess, for the Liberals, it will be up to them to choose their leader and then up to Canadians. Lots to watch. I know you're making a lot of calls, Katie, so thank you so much.
Thanks, Michelle.
We'll watch to see what responses you get as well. That's Katie DeRosa, CBC's Provincial Affairs reporter in BC. And many, many more emails here. Jacqueline writes from Ladysmith regarding the two-party system. Comment from Gordon. We're a four-party system withheld from true representation by the first-past-the-post electoral system. Thank you for that email. Jojo writes on Mark Carney, when do you think the last time was when he had peas on toast for dinner? How can he possibly relate to ordinary working people? And Suzanne writes, the caller who said the slogans are something the Liberals started in 2015. Have you forgotten? He's just not ready. Great hair, though. Thanks for your emails. And of course, this is the big news of the day, perhaps for weeks to come as well. Justin Trudeau announcing earlier today he is resigning and stepping down as leader of the Liberal Party. And he will stay on until his successor is chosen. And the Liberal Party has about 2 months to choose a new leader. Parliament is prorogued until March 24th. The reaction from opposition politicians coming in fast and furious, swift, and lots of reaction from you on the open line. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. Much more coverage on CBC.